Okay, so with that, we have got an amazing speaker. I know that Thomas could not stop talking about him from the moment he secured him, because the author of the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard. He's a phenomenal communicator, whether in teaching or in writing. He has so much good content for the next 25 minutes. If you want to know what happens when you hear him, just look up on YouTube this meme, Jordan Peterson and Saifedean Ammous. And you will see what happens when Saifedean starts talking about blockchain and Jordan Peterson goes, wow. And that's probably what's going to happen to you guys right now. So, with no further ado, can you please give a hand who's joining us virtually, the amazing author, best-selling author, Saifedean Ammous.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Be here digitally at least. I'm going to give a brief summary of my two books, the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard. They both try and understand and explain how the monetary system, that is the Bitcoin system, and the Fiat system work. So I'll begin first with the Bitcoin Standard. This is a brief outline of what I will be talking about. What is Bitcoin, why it is unique as a form of money, what Bitcoin is good for, and the implications of the continued growth of Bitcoin in the world. I begin with my definition of Bitcoin. This is the definition that I like to use for Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer software for operating a payment network with its own native currency that is protected from unexpected inflation without having to rely on any trusted third parties. I think this captures the essence of what Bitcoin is, because Bitcoin is software. It is peer-to-peer software though, and it has its own currency, and it allows you to send money from one person to the other without having to rely on any individual authority. So everybody on the network is a peer, everybody is equal. And the most interesting thing about it for me is that the currency of the network is protected from unexpected inflation. We know exactly how many Bitcoins there are at any point in time, and we know exactly how many there's going to be in the future, and there's nothing that anybody can do about that. So the significance of this invention, for me, lies in two main properties. The first is that it is the hardest money ever discovered or invented, and secondly, it is the only working alternative to central banks for international payment settlement. So, why are these things important? So to begin with, what is used as money? Historically, money is a medium of exchange. It's something that you exchange for something else. So anything can be used as money. Anything that you buy and then later on exchange, but that you buy for the purpose of exchanging later on, not for the purpose of consuming and not for the purpose of using in production, is a form of money. So anything can be used as money. But of course, some things serve that function better than others. So rising monetary demand raises the price of money. Rising price incentivizes more production of money. This is true for any kind of money. If you start using it as money, you're holding it and increasing the demand for it beyond what people who would want to use it for its own consumption are demanding. So therefore, the increased demand leads to an increase in the price of money. But because the price goes up, that also incentivizes more production. So therefore, then that causes the price to come crashing down. So rising monetary demand leads to rising production, which then brings the price down. So the things that end up working as money are the things that resist that, the things that are hard to make. And that's why historically, we find that whatever ends up being used as money is whatever is hardest to make. So cattle at times were money, limestones, seashells, glass beads, all of these are ancient forms of money that have been utilized, and I discussed them in detail in the book because of their scarcity, because they were hard to make. Metals, when metallurgy came about, they became money, but then when metals proliferated, only the precious metals became money. And then even among government money, we see internationally, all around the world, that it is only the hardest government monies that succeed and hold on to their value and get increased demand. And even if we look at an example like prison, in prison, cigarettes are used as money because nobody can make cigarettes in prison. So all of these things in common, what they have is that they are hard to make. So why then that helps us understand why the whole world was on a gold standard by the end of the 19th century, because gold is the hardest thing to make. Gold is the thing whose supply is hardest to increase. And so the existing stockpiles of gold are always many multiples of annual production because of the fact that gold can't be consumed. There's no way to burn gold or destroy it. There's no way to reduce its supply. Once gold is mined, it just sits there and it continues to sit there for thousands of years. You know, the gold that was mined thousands of years ago and used by ancient Egyptians might be worn by somebody today in this hall. You know, it continues to change from one form of gold to another, from gold bars to gold coins to jewelry to industrial uses, but it continues to be gold and it continues to be recycled and used as gold. And so therefore, annual production every year is only adding a small, tiny percentage to the increase of the supply of gold. And that's why gold ends up working best as money, because it's hard for anybody to be able to increase the supply of gold significantly. And so that then helps us understand why Bitcoin is so important, because if gold is the hardest money that we've ever gotten, and let me just repeat on this, if you look at this chart, you see in the gray line is the supply of gold. It's constantly increasing, but the supply growth rate in the black line we see is only increasing at around 1.5% to 2% per year. We've got pretty reliable data for the last century or so, and we see that the supply only increases at around 1 or 2% per year, and that's it. That's all the increase in the supply of gold that we can make every year. So therefore, Bitcoin is extremely interesting because it's better at being gold than even gold, because Bitcoin's supply, as we see, it increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate, and it's capped. There's a hard cap on the supply of Bitcoin. It's not going to increase forever. So the supply growth rate for Bitcoin declines over time. We continue to see the supply growth rate decline over time. Currently, it's at around 2% per year, and every 4 years it drops by half, and then it continues to decline more and more and more. But and that means that the total supply increases at a decreasing rate. Therefore, eventually it stops increasing, and then eventually it stabilizes at 21 million. This means that there's only 21 million Bitcoin. That's the only thing that will ever exist. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. And that, I think, is enormously significant because, again, if you look, and I discussed this in more detail in the book, if you look at the architecture of how Bitcoin works, you realize that this isn't just, you know, a feature that can be removed and added. There's nobody out there who can make more than 21 million Bitcoin. And if you don't agree, I encourage you to go and try and see how far you get. So this is what makes Bitcoin so unique as a form of money. The more that something is chosen as a store of value, the more its production increases at the margin. Except Bitcoin. When Bitcoin is chosen as a store of value, its value goes up, but more production is not possible. Instead, the difficulty of mining new Bitcoin increases, making Bitcoin harder to produce. This incentivizes more processing power to produce Bitcoin, making the network more secure. This is how Bitcoin is different from every other form of money. With every other form of money, if people demand it as a store of value, that causes the price to rise, that makes mining more profitable, that causes the supply to increase, and then that results in the price dropping. With Bitcoin, on the other hand, if the store of value demand increases, the price rises, people produce more Bitcoin, or mining becomes more profitable, but you can't make more Bitcoin. There is no supply increase. The supply is still going to increase at the predetermined rate. And then as a result, we are going to see that more hash power is going to go to mining Bitcoin. So mining Bitcoin becomes more expensive, which means that the network is harder to attack, which makes Bitcoin more secure, which makes Bitcoin survive longer, which in turn increases the demand for Bitcoin. And this is the cycle that we see Bitcoin has been going through over the last 10 to 13 years now. It just continues to increase in value, and then that causes it to survive longer, and then that increases in value more and more and more. So this is what we call the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin. It is, for me, the most amazing thing about Bitcoin because it protects the network from inflation, it ensures the supply is auditable and verifiable by all network members, and it converts people's inevitable incentive to increase Bitcoin supply into network security. This is what's so unique about Bitcoin, and what makes it such a powerful force of economic incentives. Whereas everyone competes to inflate all other monies, people compete to secure Bitcoin. Nobody can make more Bitcoin. You can only make Bitcoin more secure. So As a result of that, the processing power that is used to secure only 500,000 transactions of Bitcoin per day, roughly, is around 150 exahash, 250 exahash per second at this point. I should have updated this slide. 250 exahashes per second, which is around 10 million times as large as the world's top supercomputer. It's about 1 million times the world's top 500 supercomputers combined, and it's 10 trillion times your laptop. So the network of Bitcoin has about as much processing power as 10 times what your laptop has. The same 500,000 transactions can be done on a single computer, but Bitcoin does these transactions without relying on anyone or anything. That's the problem with having it on your computer, is that if your computer gets stolen or hacked or destroyed, then the entire system falls apart. Bitcoin is able to achieve this without relying on anybody or anything. So Bitcoin has no single point of failure, has no single piece of critical hardware or infrastructure. It has no single critical individual or organization. There's nobody that is relied upon in order for Bitcoin to work. Anybody in Bitcoin could die tomorrow. Anything using Bitcoin could die tomorrow. And Bitcoin continues to churn a new block every 10 minutes. Bitcoin basically can't be stopped. It's a protocol that's always open to anyone who wants it. Around every 10 minutes, a new block of transactions is released, and it has never failed. And it's never confirmed a fraudulent transaction. So the importance of this is that what we have here is that this is the hardest money that has ever been invented, and it's available worldwide for anyone who can receive 2 megabytes of data every 10 minutes. It's purely voluntarily. It does not need regulation, enforcement, or police, and it is chosen and valued freely on the market. In other words, it's sound money, according to the Austrian school definition, is that it is money that is chosen freely on the market. Its value is not dictated by anybody. So what is Bitcoin good for if we combine all of these properties? Well, we see that it is the first strictly scarce liquid asset. It's the first thing that we have that's strictly scarce. Before Bitcoin, the only thing that was truly scarce was human time. And I recommend The Ultimate Resource, a great book by Julian Simon. And in it, he describes how we continue to make more and more of every single resource that's available on Earth, because the limiting factor on how much we can make of all of those resources is not how much we have in the Earth, because the Earth is enormous. It's how much time we dedicate to it. So anything chosen as a store of value has the imperfection that its supply will increase in response, causing a loss of the value stored. But Bitcoin beats that because it's the only thing that's genuinely scarce. Nobody can make more Bitcoins, just like nobody can make more time for you. Your time is limited. You can't increase it infinitely. And similarly, you can't increase Bitcoin. So that makes it, for me, as a natural fit for a store of value, because it is something that you can't make more of. So that's why also I think of it as the most advanced technology for transferring the value of time into the future, because its supply cannot be diluted. So what is Bitcoin good for? It's a decentralized free market alternative to central banking. That's the other significant thing about it. If it continues to not die, which it's done well over the last 13 years, demand for Bitcoin will continue to rise indefinitely, because hard money is not optional. You can't isolate yourself from the consequences of others using money that is harder than yours. All other forms of money, as you see around the world, they continue to get inflated, and more continues to get made, and more of the supply increases. So people who store their wealth in any other form of money will continue to witness its value decline. But Bitcoin's supply doesn't increase, and so overall, in the long run, its value continues to increase. So people who store wealth in Bitcoin will benefit at the expense of people who don't store wealth in Bitcoin. So Bitcoin transactions cannot handle consumer payments for everyone who needs hard money on chain, but we're witnessing second layer solutions that are being developed on top of Bitcoin, and these can increase transactions almost infinitely. So what we're seeing is that Bitcoin's on-chain network is becoming more like a settlement network for large value transactions, mimicking central banks in what they do, but of course doing it at a much better way, because it's more decentralized and it is far more resistant to inflation than what central banks offer as money. So because of this, I don't think Bitcoin on-chain can scale for mass payments number, but Bitcoin on-chain will be like a network that is an alternative for central banks. And this is enormously significant because there are no other alternative to central banks. You can't get around central banks, but Bitcoin can. And so we're getting something, and this is where the title of my book, The Bitcoin Standard, comes from. We're getting something similar with Bitcoin to gold standard. Everyone wanted to get paid in gold because gold was the hardest money, as I discussed in the Bitcoin Standard. But then because moving gold around is expensive, we moved to second layer solutions based on gold. But Bitcoin is far more resistant to government capture than gold because the cost of running a Bitcoin full node, if you want to think about it, is far lower than running a gold full node. In other words, if you want to send gold around the world, you have to basically have an army that can establish sovereignty, and you have to trust that army, and you have to trust the central bank that handles that. And we saw how badly that worked out over the 20th century. Well, Bitcoin allows anybody to send their gold, their digital gold, around the world without having to rely on the authority of anybody else. Just run your own Bitcoin node. So what does this mean? If we have a hard money that is available for everybody everywhere, well, now international payments are possible without having to go through governments and central banks. The 21st century global digital free market will grow around Bitcoin, the internet's decentral bank, if you want, running on hard money. That's what I mean by the Bitcoin standard. So what are the implications for individuals, politics, and capital markets? The first implication that I like to discuss, which I find is an enormously fascinating topic, is time preference. I think hard money encourages future orientation, whereas easy money encourages short-termism. With easy money, you expect your money to lose value over time, so you don't have an easy way to save for the future, so you focus on consumption. You spend the money now because if you hold on to it, it's going to lose value over time. So easy money causes you to become a short-term oriented person. Hard money, on the other hand, gains value over time and encourages you to save for the future, encourages you to accumulate capital rather than spend. And therefore, that encourages you to become more of a long-term person. So easy money, another way of looking at it, is artificially low interest rates, which creates an incentive to borrow more and save less. A move to a Bitcoin standard would look a little bit like a move to the gold standard. It'll cause people to start saving more and to get into less and less debt. In fact, if we look historically, we see today, saving rates are very low, and they are far lower than what they were under the gold standard. And in fact, if we look throughout since 1971, when the US dollar was decoupled from gold, we see that saving rates globally have declined more and more and more. And in fact, the one country that has maintained relatively high saving rates is Switzerland, which was the last country to go off the gold standard. It only went off the gold standard really in the 1990s, you could say. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, but I mean, their currency was much harder than the US dollar throughout the 20th century. So it maintained a higher saving rate. So one way of looking at it is that the world is going to become more and more like Switzerland. Bitcoin is basically going to make the world like Switzerland in the 20th century. It's a place where you had a hard money and you had a free market. And of course, one thing that you don't hear about much is that Switzerland, under the gold standard, had no unemployment. There was basically no unemployment. If you look up until the 1970s, when the Swiss franc was pegged to gold, Switzerland's unemployment rate was practically zero. It started to increase in the 1970s when they were forced to depeg from gold. And then in the 1990s, when they basically became much more inflationary and their monetary policy started to track the euro, now the Swiss economy suffers from all the problems of modern Keynesian central banks. Inflation and business cycles and recessions are both the two sides of the same coin, and that coin is called central banking. And so that coin is the central planning of capital markets. We know central planning works in all, we know central planning fails in all markets, and in the capital markets, central planning results in inflations and recessions, as we see happening all over the world today. So this is one aspect. Another aspect of it is that I think Bitcoin allows us to have one global money, which is an enormously important thing. In the 19th century, the whole world at the end of the 19th century used gold. So you could trade all over the world with one money that was just moved around. But in the 20th century, we effectively uninvented global money and replaced it with a system of partial barter, where now, if you want to trade across international lines, you have to first buy another person's currency in order before you can before you can buy it. So that's effectively barter. You have to buy something first before you buy something else. And so that's obviously a major problem, and it creates this global cancer that is the foreign exchange market, which is absolutely unconscionable amount of waste and unconscionable amount of destruction, because you have so many businesses that get destroyed because of because of exchange rate fluctuations through no fault of their own. If you're following markets the last few weeks, you're seeing all crazy things happening with the dollar and the euro and the yen and the pound, and businesses are being wiped out because of these changes in exchange rates. And it's just insane that in the 21st century, where everything is international and global and hyper connected, we need to run with this system of all these partial barter monetary system. And then I think another aspect here is the implication for individual liberty, is that the move towards fiat money is what allowed government to control a lot of people's lives, because they can use your wealth, they can devalue your wealth with inflation to finance their spending on coercive and totalitarian moves. And that's why, governments were much stronger and more powerful and more interventionist in the 20th century than they were in the 19th century. On the other hand, Switzerland, which remained on the gold standard well beyond everybody else, had basically the freest economy in the world practically for most of the 20th century, although now it is becoming more and more similar to other countries. So in short, Bitcoin is a technological and apolitical solution to the problem of international value transfer and to the problem of saving. It is giving us a free market in money, in savings, in capital, and investments. That's my case for Bitcoin. Now, the cost of Bitcoin, currently it's around 100 to 150 terawatt hour per year of electricity, and that's mostly at around 6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about $2 to $6 billion per year. That's how much we are paying right now to have this alternative monetary system. The total lifetime security cost for Bitcoin so far is around $30 billion. This has produced around $1 trillion of, this is a little outdated. Now it's closer to $0.4 trillion of savings, but it's more than a 10x return on the amount of investment that has been paid for securing Bitcoin. So we've invested $30 billion in building this infrastructure and securing it, and it's given us about $400 billion of savings. Now, how does that compare to the fiat standard? What is the fiat standard? Well, the fiat monetary system, if you think about it as a monetary system similar to Bitcoin, the difference is that, first of all, it was never consciously designed and proposed and adopted freely. Nobody ever implemented the design of fiat and then told people, hey, if you want to use this, use it. It was effectively born from government default on gold obligations. When government issued more debt and liabilities than they had on hand, they had to make do by making their own credit as money. And the birth of the fiat standard, I highly recommend looking into it, was started off in World War I, when the Bank of England basically financed World War I by buying government's bonds, which the public did not buy. This might ring some bells if you're following the news right now, but when Britain wanted to enter World War I, the British people had the good sense not to buy the bonds to go into fight a war that they had no interest in. But the Bank of England still wanted to fight the war, and so the Bank of England went and bought the bonds, and one of their mouthpieces is the Financial Times, and the Financial Times published a piece saying the Bank of England's bond issue was successful and everybody bought the bonds. But in fact, less than a third of the bonds were bought, and then 2/3 of the bonds were bought by the Bank of England. So the Bank of England effectively devalued the British pound in order to buy bonds, in order to send Britain into war in World War I, which the public did not want. And that's what gave us the fiat standard. That's how the fiat standard was born. The intellectual justifications for the fiat monetary system came later. This is a very important point. Keynesian economists and fiat-paid economists and central bank economists like to pretend that their system is there because it works better, that somehow somebody realized there was a problem with gold and that we could make gold better. We can make a better money than gold if we just start printing more and more money. Well, that's nonsense. They came up with all of these explanations after they had already been bankrupt. This was just a way of managing their default on gold. So it's the model for the for the fiat standard came from the Bank of England's dealing with colonies, and it's a lie that dragged on for 50 plus years before taking its final form in 1971. And then something that started at the Bank of England, but then moved to the Bank of the Federal Reserve. And there's really only one full node in the fiat system that decides the protocol rules and the transaction validity, and that's the US Federal Reserve. Mining is done through lending. This is a very important point. In Bitcoin, we mine Bitcoin through the process of producing new Bitcoin. In fiat, new fiat is mined by lending. When a bank issues a new notes, new loans, more money is created. And I think this is a very powerful way for understanding how the fiat system works. Any financial institution with a lending license from a central bank can issue new money by lending. Supply increases haphazardly and supply decreases when debt collapses, as we see right now. There's no clear mechanism for how much fiat is there. It's just constantly getting created every time new loans are created, and it's constantly getting destroyed when loans are being defaulted on. So fiat is effectively a monopoly on providing the domestic fiat coin and determining the supply and price. This is what the central bank has. It has a monopoly on who can issue money and who can issue debt. It's a monopoly on clearing international payments. It's a monopoly authority over licensing and regulating domestic banks, holding their reserves and clearing payments between them. Lending, and it's a monopoly, and it also lends to respective national governments by buying bonds. So you combine those four functions in a central bank and you get the fiat system. You give this one entity a monopoly on providing the money supply, a monopoly on clearing international payments, and a monopoly over licensing and regulating domestic banks, holding the reserves, and clearing payments between them. And then, if you want to make this truly catastrophic, what do you do with that monopoly? You let it buy government bonds. You couldn't ask for a more destructive recipe for disaster, but that's how fiat works. So the way that fiat works is effective, that it's constantly reducing the wealth of its users to finance government and government-approved entity. It destroys people's ability to plan for the future, raising their time preference, increases government's ability to dictate reality, with enormous implications on food, family, architecture, education, science, and much more, which I get into a lot of detail in the fiat standard. And so, in conclusion, effectively, fiat is a political solution to international value transfer, to saving, like Bitcoin, but it's also a solution to the problem of government finance. How do you finance government at the expense of society? And it's a solution to the problem of banks being bankrupt. How do you allow banks to get into bankruptcy? How do you allow banks to operate after they've gone bankrupt because they're irresponsible? That's what fiat allows. It allows banks to escape the consequences of their actions. So it's a centrally controlled command economy in money, savings, capital, and investments with disastrous consequences. The only benefit of fiat is that it saves a little bit on gold transportation fees, which is very small, but the costs it gives us enormous amounts of inflation. The global average is around 32%. The weighted global average is around 14%. A quarter of global wealth is in money, so fiat costs us around 3.6% of human wealth per year, or around $15 trillion per year. It's just the cost of inflation through fiat. And it predominantly hurts the poorest people because they're the ones who hold cash the most. It creates enormous amounts of economic distortions. It creates very powerful fiat governments. And perhaps most brutally, it incentivizes conflict. These are the problems of the fiat standard. So my next book is The Principles of Economics. It's a textbook on economics, which you can read the chapters of. It's almost done on my website, Saifedean.com, and it'll be out in a few months. The Bitcoin standard is now available in 35 languages, and the fiat standard is available in 12 languages. And you can go to my website to find out more about these books and my online courses, and sign up to my email list, saifedean.com/email. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for that fantastic presentation. I hope you guys will get a copy of the books, as you can see, in multiple languages. And if you don't have one, grab a hold of it.